Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Headline Geopolitics. I'm your host, José Niño. And today I have the pleasure of having on Keith Knight, the managing editor of the Libertarian Institute. How are you today, Keith?
I am doing very well, Jose. Thank you for having me on, brother.
No problem, man. I've really enjoyed your work at the Libertarian Institute, especially your content that critiques American foreign policy from a libertarian standpoint. How did you reach your current non-interventionist conclusions about foreign policy?
That is a good question. I'd have to go back some years. So I would say the starting point would have been in 2012 when I was attending the GOP debates in Arizona. Ron Paul was on the stage and Mitt Romney was on the stage, and I had more or less assumed that it's important to have a U.S. empire playing whack-a-mole with all the terrible people in the world, especially the first ones you want to focus on are the ones who threaten you, people like Al-Qaeda, for example. But second, you also want to foresee threats in the future. This, looking back, was very short-sighted. I immediately assumed that Al-Qaeda was a threat as a cause result of us being so great and their insecurities, coming out in the form of using terrorism against the West. Once I tried to build up a solid foundation for how did I come to this belief? Is this something just inherently true that we know based on rational analysis that we could, just think about in, your easy chair? Or is this a claim that can actually be falsified? So when I came across the literature of, you can use a number of sources, but take the book, The Al-Qaeda Reader, with the introduction written by Victor Davis Hanson, the court historian. It turns out that there were a list of grievances by Osama bin Laden that I had never considered. Now, when you're reading this work, you have to look at the incentives that bin Laden faced in his letter to America. He had every incentive to actually make his grievances clear. Just as, say what you will about Chairman Mao, Joseph Stalin, when these people had less power, when they were fighting their revolutions, during the Bolshevik Revolution with Stalin and Lenin, during Mao's initial revolution against Chiang Kai-shek, when they're in that position, they have every incentive to actually list their genuine grievances. So I was surprised to hear that there was a bombing campaign in Iraq throughout the 1990s. I thought we had basically been hands off of Iraq until George Bush launched the operation to remove Saddam Hussein. So bin Laden mentioning that was surprising. Also, the fact that there were sanctions and more or less a blockade. This would have been a close blockade of Iraq where things could be inspected as opposed to a distant blockade where you just drop mines in the waters outside. So this was a close blockade. Now, it's well understood that the U.S. has a position. If China blockades Taiwan 1,000+ miles away, well, that's an act of war. And as President Biden said on 60 Minutes, the U.S. would respond militarily because that's a violation of independence. But the U.S. government was blockading Iraq for like a decade. I mean, this is totally unjustifiable. Another thing bin Laden mentioned is that these bombings were taking place from the bases in what's referred to as the land of Mecca and Medina. These would have been bases in Saudi Arabia. The U.S. government had an agreement with, I believe, King Fahd at the time. It must have been King Fahd because that's who Osama bin Laden's 1995 letter was written to. How dare you conspire with the American imperialists and let them occupy the land of, Muhammad. And then the third reason was the U.S. support for Israel escalating in the Qana massacre of 1996, motivating someone like Muhammad Atta to join the Mujahideen fighters led by Osama bin Laden. So when I realized that this decades-long war was based on a verifiable lie, and then I saw the U.S. government who apparently it's like, look, the only reason you're not terrified of Al-Qaeda, first of all, you should be. Second of all, we have access to tons of classified information. We're in a position to know Al-Qaeda is your enemy. I can't tell you all the reasons because, again, classified, but trust us, we know. And then the U.S. government had an alliance with al-Qaeda to take down the Bashar al-Assad regime. They supported the al-Qaeda fighters known as LIFG, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, to take down Muammar Gaddafi, even though Muammar Gaddafi was one of the first leaders to put out an arrest warrant for Osama bin Laden. I want to say that was in 1996 he did that. And then, of course, the blatant alliance with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula when the Houthi regime was being supported by Tehran. So you see how fake this is. The former leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, his new name, hold on, let me get this right. It used to be Gilani. I think his new name is Ahmed al-Sharaa. He was just interviewed by the former CIA director, General Petraeus, in New York City. And Petraeus says to him, you have a lot of fans here, and I'm one of them, and we're curious. How are you doing? Are you getting enough sleep at night? Are you having enough time to think? Because we're worried.
Total softball, yeah.
This was supposed to be the pure evil. We don't want to be an empire. We don't want to spend $1 trillion a year, $800 billion a year on our defense budget. But we have to, because there's al-Qaeda out there who want to kill you because you have the right to vote. And then it turns out it's like that was actually just a convenient lie, and we're happy to form an alliance with these guys when it's beneficial. So seeing that it was such a blatant scam, that was the first thing. I later came across a work published. So you might think, well, this is an outlier. First of all, this scam took place in a first world country where people had access to the internet. So even if it is an outlier, it's an extremely damning one, considering how many lives the war on terror took, how long it lasted, how much information people had access to. There was a book written, I want to say it was in 1928, by a historian named Arthur Ponsonby. Gosh, I'm going to forget the whole title. I believe it's called Falsehood in Wartime. And in 1928, this guy was saying, yeah, the First World War, the countries involved in the First World War basically lied relentlessly to their populations. And it's one of those things where you say, well, the current one is based on a lie. This guy brings forth a ton of evidence that there were lies in the First World War. Is there any lesson to extract? And he actually puts forth a thesis in this book, Falsehood in Wartime. He says that deception is almost necessary. Explicit deception and general sensationalism is vitally important in order to get people to risk getting their limbs blown off in warfare, to risk having their children, who they've spent years raising and loving, to send them off hundreds of miles away to get shot at. That is a really rough sell. So first of all, you need conscription. Second of all, you need to force people to fund it through taxation. It helps if you have a central bank. But you also have to propagandize the public so they don't actively resist or subvert the operation. And this is why deception is necessary in wartime as far as the psychopath classes of the country see it. Because they can't tell you, look, we are going to risk a nuclear exchange with Russia. And the reason is we want Donetsk and Luhansk to answer to Kiev. We don't want Donetsk and Luhansk to answer to Moscow. So that's what this is over. No, they have to say Putin's going to start with the Donbass. He's going to take that over. Then he's going to take Kiev over. Then he's going to take Eastern Europe over. Then he's going to
domino
take Western
effect.
Europe over. And then he's going to take over South America. Then he's going to take over Mexico. And then he's going to take over America. Then you idiots will be sorry. It's like they can't tell you the truth about what's actually happening. Even Jens Stoltenberg, the former general secretary of NATO, said that basically this, he explicitly says that, I don't have the quote off the top of my head, but Stoltenberg himself said that this war is a result of NATO expansion and Putin feeling threatened. Just as the U.S. is trying to display its adherence to the Monroe Doctrine by taking out Venezuelan alleged boats that are trafficking drugs. It's just about having a sphere of influence. China wants one. Russia wants one. America wants one. Britain wanted one. The French Empire wanted one.
Basic geopolitics.
The Japanese empire. I've never heard of an empire not wanting a sphere of influence, so this is just totally normal. That's why the wars are based on lies in general, and that's how I came across these ideas.
Your path is very similar to mine because I also came into these ideas through Ron Paul. The non-interventionist foreign policy was the major selling point for me. And it's amusing in a way because even though Paul in both of his Republican runs in 07 and 2008 and 2012, they were mocked by the establishment. The energy that he exuded there was manifested during the Trump campaign of 2016, where he was ostensibly campaigning on a more kind of restrained, realist foreign policy, critiquing the Iraq war and wanting to wind down things in Afghanistan. However, Trump in office, both of his terms and his ongoing second term especially, appears to be a mixed bag. What is your general assessment of Trump's foreign policy accomplishments thus far?
Yeah, well, after hearing the GOP brag about how pro-life they are for the last, 20 years of my life, to see them justify mass murder, they'll either explicitly justify it, as they did in the Bush years and the Obama years, justify indiscriminate killing of people for totally unjustifiable reasons. Then they say, all right, we're against these wars because they're stupid, they're pointless, they're not in our interest, they're never-ending forever wars. I mean, if that's your opposition to mass death and mass destruction of cities, which took a century to build up, infrastructure which people's lack of suffering relies on, it seems extremely shallow, because it on very few occasions, if any. I think one time in a CNN town hall, Trump said, the killing needs to stop, referencing Ukraine and Russia. That was maybe the closest he's gotten. So far, so much for being the peace candidate. He doesn't seem to have a really reliable opposition to these things. So if I said, okay, let's go to war with a country, we'll have a specific end date and we can prove that it's, quote, in our interest. Whatever that means, we could extract the resources. It could, scare other potential enemies into submission. If that's your criteria, it's not going to be something that can be consistently relied upon when there is a potential threat. I suspect that Trump knows that the enemies of the Council on Foreign Relations and the U.S. empire are basically a scam. This is why he was so open to talking to Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin. I like that he said, right when Trump got elected, he said something like, I'm close friends with Xi Jinping, I'm close friends with Vladimir Putin. One of the things that I want to do is have the three of us get together and talk about how we could cut our defense budgets in half. And that looked great, but he hasn't gone back on that. In fact, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, has come out and said, we're looking to get our first $1 trillion budget at the Pentagon. Just absolute psychopathy. These people think that they're so generous. And, oh, look at me. I'm such a good person. I want to spend even more on defense. It doesn't occur to them that this actually provokes enemies. And also, it's not his money. So you're just being generous with money that other people have earned. You're just putting obligations on tons of strangers without any knowledge as to whether or not there's a correlation between higher defense spending and an increase in safety. So very upset in general with how Trump has orchestrated these things. My whole reasoning for reluctantly favoring him over Harris was simply he wanted to meet with Putin and Xi. He had said that on multiple occasions. And Kamala Harris showed no interest to reach out to Vladimir Putin, even though more or less a proxy war is being fought between these two powers. It's not as though I said, well, Trump's a good guy. He said he wants peace. Therefore, I'm going to support him. It was much more of a, will he be able to find this as a profitable endeavor for his long-term political interests? And I thought that was a plausible explanation. So I think we're in a better position than we otherwise would have been with Harris. I could totally see counter arguments to that, so I'm not dead set in that. I really do like his willingness to speak to other leaders and just see them as, potential people to make a deal with at some point, as opposed to this is an axis of evil who can never be talked to. At least we have Donald Trump saying, of course we can talk to them. So I would say that is my general analysis. Of course, in the case of Iran, it is just too pathetic when people say, well, he had always said, he said not that he was an anti-war president, but also he said Iran couldn't have a nuclear weapon. So it was totally consistent for him to launch the 12-day war, forgetting that it was Donald Trump in his first term that unilaterally pulled out of the JCPOA, which I'm not a nuclear expert, by any reasonable metric, that was constraining Iran's ability to make a nuke. Not because the Ayatollah is so kind and virtuous, but he probably didn't want a nuclear weapon for the same reason Mohammed bin Salman told Brett Baer on Fox News that he doesn't want a nuclear weapon because that would create an arms race in the Middle East. So the JCPOA was very beneficial. It's as much as I hate anytime two politicians get together, JCPOA was an example of, hey, look, something not evil. Let's hold on to that.
Exception
But
to the rule.
Unfortunately, it didn't. Unfortunately, it didn't. And then Trump unilaterally pulled out of the Open Skies Treaty, which allowed the observation. Dwight D. Eisenhower mentions this in his book, Mandate for Change. He came up with this idea of open skies where the Russians and the Americans can observe the geographical areas where airplanes and nuclear weapons are stored, just so they could make sure the other country is not mobilizing for warfare. That was another one that Trump unjustifiably pulled out of. He seems to vilify the Chinese as often as he can, and that is just horrible. Every time I hear them say, China's ripping us off, I go, I feel like you're trying to rile me up to hate this group in order to justify a potential war against them. So, that is my general analysis. Disappointed, but I think better than the alternative.
Do you think the recent ceasefire in Gaza will hold, or do you think that some type of flare-up in a conflict between Israel and Hamas is inevitable?
I would say no. If you're asking for my prediction, no, it's not going to hold. I believe Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and Netanyahu are going to say, we got the last bit of leverage that Hamas had with the hostages, and now we're just going to find a justification to level the place, develop an ethnic cleansing operation. That is what I would guess. This was a plan originally in the 1920s by Zeev Jabotinsky, who was a Zionist freedom fighter for independence, what we would call a terrorist, what any sane person would call a terrorist.
Yes.
And his whole thing was, the one thing we want is the one thing the Arabs don't want, which is Jewish immigration. They're never going to accept us. Just as the Americans had to put the natives on a reservation, we're going to have to put the Arabs on a reservation and hold them in with an iron wall, because no respectable people wants to see their land conquered. They're going to resist it to the death. So we could either do nothing and keep getting pogromed in Europe, or we could establish a state for ourselves. I don't know what the borders of this state is supposed to be. The 67 line, obviously not the 48 line, maybe the 67 line. Maybe it'll include the 67 line plus the West Bank. I don't think they want Gaza that bad. They just see it as a threat to the amount of power they have in Israel. They certainly want what they refer to as Judea and Samaria, what we refer to in the West as the West Bank. I think they just want to cleanse the place more or less. I think they would originally want exactly what, if I hope saying this name doesn't kill the video circulation, but Hitler's original plan with the German Zionist Federation of 1897, his plan with them in 1933 is referred to as the Havara Agreement, which is the plan that the Zionists and the National Socialists had. Hey, let's come together. You don't want this troublesome minority in the way they saw it, a troublesome minority in Germany. And we're Zionists. We don't want them here either. We want them in Palestine. So let's come up with an agreement to move them 1,800 miles away from here. So the Israeli government, I don't think their first plan is to kill them all. They would like them to just be so terrified that they move out. I suspect the Israeli government's just going to keep finding justifications now that Hamas does not have the leverage of the hostages, because for so long, all we ever heard from Rabbi Shmuley was Hamas could end the bombing today if they release the hostages. Well, they released the hostages, and then the bombing campaign started again after, what, I want to say it was like 48 hours, this most recent ceasefire held that Donald Trump was bragging about. So I suspect that the Israeli government is not going to allow anything they define as Hamas to exist there, and they're going to ramp up the mass murder assault on Gaza until that happens. And then they're going to expand into the West Bank. The plan that Finance Minister Smotrich put forth was 82% of the West Bank would belong to Israel. I just see it as such a liability to be supporting these people. By these people, I just mean the Israeli government and their plans to expand. I know people like Daniela Weiss would like to see the original Greater Israel plan from the Nile to the Euphrates. So, no, I see no reason to believe that the ceasefire will hold, because the lunatics with power in both the American and Israeli government have tons of leverage and nuclear weapons. They have very little incentive to change their behavior, and Hamas does not have the hostages to use as leverage, which I'm grateful for that the hostages on both sides have been released, but I think this is just going to ramp up the killing. That is my reluctant prediction. If I am wrong, I promise to come back on the show and say, thank God I was wrong.
Yes, I do hope that we are wrong and peace becomes a thing in Gaza, but it's looking unlikely. With respect to Russia, Ukraine, where do you see things going there? We hear all this talk about a potential sit down between Putin and Trump happening, like a follow-up after the Alaska summit, which really did not generate much. And it just seems like there's like always this weird dynamic where there's a speculation about talks going down, and then the Europeans complain, and then the Trump administration comes with like a new threat of supplying some form of military aid, whether it's like Tomahawk missiles or other forms of equipment to Ukraine. Seems like that I almost feel like at this point there's not going to be a diplomatic settlement happening anytime in the short term. It almost get the impression that this will be settled on the battlefield.
I don't know, really. It's so hard to guess about what the future holds. What I think is the most vitally important thing is to ask, what is being fought for? Is it a piece of land? Is it a people? Is it in the First World War, Niall Ferguson makes the case that it wasn't land or a people. It was basically a European Union led by Kaiser Wilhelm. That's really what was being fought over. So it's hard to know what the future holds. It's so long as people know what's being fought over. It appears that the general terms are Russia is demanding neutrality on behalf of the Ukrainians, as opposed to them being a member of NATO. I think they certainly want regime change in Kiev, not just Zelensky saying that he's going to be allegedly neutral. Moscow sees the Kiev regime as basically a group of American puppets installed in 2014, initially with Arseny Yatsenyuk after the Maidan Revolution. The Donbass, including Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, I think that area, I think, would be controlled by the Russian Federation. That is what Putin wants now. Realize if democracy is so vitally important that people must have the right to vote, you have to consider an alternative where people vote for a thing that you find offensive. Why would the people in the Donbass, have a referendum and vote in support of joining the Russian Federation? Maybe for the same reason that the people in Puerto Rico like being part of America. Maybe the same reason that people in Alaska or Hawaii, some of them, like being part of the American empire. They feel like they're on the side of a very powerful organization. Maybe that's why the people in the Donbass want that. So if that's what general public opinion is yielding in the Donbass, I can't imagine that Kiev could take those places back and hold those people back from resisting. They'd have to have a completely Palantir-run police state where those people had no free speech. They could never resist the Kiev regime. It would make more sense for Kiev to allow them to secede. So I don't know what's going to happen. I am optimistic that things like the Alaska summit took place. Fortunately, in 1959, when Nikita Khrushchev came to America and shook hands with Dwight Eisenhower, he toured America for about 10 days. I think this made it, this sort of gave the idea that Khrushchev was someone who could be reasoned with and spoken to. So when John F. Kennedy got a letter from Khrushchev in 1962, hearing, hey, obviously you've heard about our situation in Cuba. We would like guarantees that there will not be regime change in Cuba. We would like missiles to be removed from our sphere of influence, Italy and Turkey. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis negotiation. So I think anytime there can be meetings which increase the likelihood of other meetings taking place if there are extremely high tensions, I think that can be a good thing. So I'm glad that not just Trump is talking to these people, but his supporters at large have this as something that they support, that they think is a good idea. I think that'll certainly encourage him. Just like his original position on the Epstein files was, are you still talking about that guy, that creep, whatever, Pam Bondi, if you want to answer this question. He got grilled so much by so many supporters that he came out and totally reversed the position. He's like, all right, yeah, Pam Bondi is going to work on it. So if he sees that it's profitable for him specifically to shake hands with Putin, shake hands with Xi Jinping, even shake hands with Hamas, maybe not Trump specifically, but Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in their 60 Minutes interview allegedly met with Hamas directly. And Witkoff tells a very interesting story about being able to relate to the gentleman whose son was killed in the Israeli strike in Qatar, because Steve Witkoff had lost his child to an overdose as well. So when I see these things, I'm much more optimistic than I otherwise would be if it was just the George Bush foreign policy of, this is an axis of evil who cannot be reasoned with under any circumstances. Every single leader in the world is a potential Hitler, and anyone who disagrees with me is Neville Chamberlain. This is a little more complex and a little more well-rounded. So I'm more optimistic than I would be otherwise under almost anyone else.
One final point I want to touch upon that I've really enjoyed about your work has been your critiques about foreign aid, because this is a subject that is often taken as a given in foreign policy discussions, and it's seen as a normal function of statecraft. But from what I've read based on your research is that foreign aid is not so benign, and that in fact it comes with many negative unintended consequences. Could you break down why foreign aid is actually quite deleterious and why it ultimately should be phased out?
Initially, foreign aid, or foreign welfare, as I like to call it, this at its base, best case scenario, is the U.S. government putting obligations on its domestic population to coercively collect money and allocate to other governments across the world. Now, when you are faced with those incentives, if I had the power to do that, the likelihood of me doing this responsibly, making sure that the money was well spent, it wasn't going to crazy people, there weren't going to be unintended consequences, no nefarious people were getting access to the money. It is so naive to think that this would not corrupt someone, having that much power. And the important part is it's not like everyone pays half their income in foreign aid every 2 weeks to the federal government. It's only a small fraction of the total tax bill. This is both a good thing because you don't have to pay that much, but there is a downside to it being such a small amount, meaning people are less likely to resist it and say, this needs to be abolished. So when governments are facing those incentives, they say, what are people going to complain about? The price of a postage stamp for each American on their tax bill? Let's send it here. Let's send it there. Let's, not really pay close attention to the downsides of what happens as a causal result, who's empowered. So just looking at it on the incentives, very important. Second of all, in 2013, Victoria Nuland said, I want to say the date was December 21st, 2013. She was the assistant secretary to Eurasian Affairs. She had said, the U.S. has spent more than $5 billion bringing democracy to Ukraine and bringing stability. So this is just before the coup in 2014, that leading to a 7-year civil war on and off between the Ukrainian nationalists and the Donbass secessionists. Just as America seceded from Great Britain, these people in the Donbass were attempting to secede from Kiev. And then after that, in 2022, it led to the full-scale invasion. So not only is it, we're just helping people, you're also potentially provoking enemies because the government does not have the incentive to watch how these dollars are spent closely. And hey, if it does provoke a war with Russia, well, then the government and the military establishment benefits from that because they get to spend more money and say, look, Putin's a boogeyman, give our government more power. His motive is just to take over the world. It has nothing to do with anything we've done with the $800 billion a year that you people have given us. So the incentives are inherently bad. This is an example of it really blowing up in our face. The most common example that I've used, though, is from a book titled The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and 9/11. A gentleman named Lawrence Wright wrote this book. And according to him, Muhammad Atta, in April of 1996, saw the atrocities of Operation Grapes of Wrath, the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon. And this is what motivated Muhammad Atta, the commander-in-chief of the 9/11 attacks, to pledge his allegiance to Osama bin Laden. And why did they respond to, America with the crimes of Israel? As bin Laden says, he sees Israel as basically a puppet state that, as much as the Israeli government is able to control the Americans, it's really the Americans with their high capacity to produce weapons that feed the Israelis and commit crimes against the Lebanese and the Palestinians and the Syrians. So we have both empirical evidence in the real world of foreign policy doing it, of foreign aid doing a terrible job, and then you have the trillions of dollars that has been given to Africa, and we have not seen anything to really brag about in the case of this foreign aid. It's not like foreign aid is necessary for countries to become wealthy. If you needed external capital to become wealthy in the first place, no country on earth would have ever gotten out of absolute poverty because there was no other planet outside the solar system to come first give us foreign aid so we could build up our country. What makes people wealthy is self-ownership, the freedom to contract, the freedom to own property, the freedom to trade. This increases the likelihood of you making mutually beneficial voluntary exchanges. It allows people to specialize in what they produce best. It allows geniuses to have more influence than they otherwise would have if they were just spending their time working on things that only affected them. So free trade, private property, this is why South Korea is wealthier than North Korea, why West Germany was wealthier than East Germany. and why America became more wealthy after the slaves were freed. I just saw Mehdi Hassan say that slavery built America. You would have seen an impoverished North and a very wealthy South with all the slavery generating all that wealth. The opposite's true. After countries abolished slavery, they became much more wealthy because they focused on things like capital investment and mass production. So, yeah, that is why foreign aid is not good for economies. That's why foreign aid is not good in terms of foreign policy. We should embrace a policy of free trade as opposed to foreign welfare. And the incentives are inherently bad. So the concept that, well, what we should do is reform it. It's a little like saying we should give the 16-year-old 10 bottles of Jack Daniels. We should give him the keys to the car. We should tell him where to buy crystal meth. And then we should tell him to be responsible. Well, once you've done all those things, you're no longer in a position to call the shots when someone has that much leverage. Once you give the government tens of billions of dollars a year to distribute in foreign aid, they're not going to want to listen to you. So that is my principled and empirical opposition to foreign aid.
That is a fantastic way to put it. And I think this is a good place to put a bookmark in the conversation, Keith. But again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come onto the show. But before we leave, could you let the audience know where they can find your latest work and what you're up to these days?
Libertarianinstitute.org. That's where you can find my articles. That's where you could find basically the educational archive that Scott Horton and I have put together at the Libertarian Institute. You can use our search engine to type in any topic you're interested in, whether it's agricultural subsidies, rent control, the minimum wage, the philosophical origins of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Rawls, or Franklin Roosevelt, anything you are interested in. So libertarianinstitute.org, you can download copies of my book, The Voluntarist Handbook, which is a textbook that I put together, the 50 most important political essays that I have come across, and my book, Domestic Imperialism, 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. You could buy those at the Libertarian Institute, or you could just download a free PDF and hopefully share it with other people who want to be able to see through the lies and the psychopathy of the current ruling class.
Great stuff. And thank you for coming out to the show, Keith. And and to the audience, make sure to check out Keith's work at libertarianinstitute.org. And I'm José Niño, Deputy Editor of Headline USA. Thank you for tuning in to Headline Geopolitics. Until next time.